Just before I arrived into this hall this morning, the Times Now people were outside pushing their mic into my face and saying, "Ma'am, how do you feel about being charged for sedation?" I said, sedation. So I said, "I'm beginning to feel a little sleepy already." But it's a very, I've never spoken in public in Kashmir before, and it's one of the most difficult things for me to do, because I don't know from what place to speak, because I'm a writer who has a very complicated past, even personally, and questions of identity, of ethnicity, of what it means to be a woman in a very male-dominated society, even in India. Forget Kashmir. I'm looking for the sisters. Hello, I can just see your five. But all these things are very, very complicated for me. And how do I begin this conversation? Because I've not come here to lecture you about what you should do about fighting this occupation. I really have come here to listen, and I've been coming here for some years now to listen and to try and understand. So I'm not at all here to tell anybody what to do, but maybe to try and speak a little bit about the complexities of some easy things that we fling around. You know, as a writer, sometimes I flinch when words are used without precision. For example, we've all come to accept that the leaders of this struggle are called separatists. What does that mean? 2 weeks ago, I was in Ranchi, and a journalist kept pushing his mic into my face and saying, "Ma'am, do you believe that Kashmir is an integral part of India? Yes or no? Yes or no?" I said, "Look, relax. Kashmir has never been an integral part of India." And there's no need for you to keep asking me this thing aggressively. It is not something I invented. It's not some radical position that I'm taking. It's a historical fact. Even the Indian government has accepted it. So let's not, use aggression in place of intelligence or information. But so when that is the case, what does it mean to call the leaders of this movement separatists? Because then you're already accepting that it's a form of secession, whereas in fact that's not the case, right? So then what do we mean when we say India? For those of us who are in a, sometimes there are so many different kinds of struggles taking place in the world. There are struggles for self-determination, and then there are struggles of those who are within nations, who suffer terrible trials. But when somebody says India or America, I begin to flounder, because I try to think, what does this mean? What does India mean? In 1947, we were told that India became a free country, a democratic, socialist, that came a bit later, but a sovereign republic when the constitution was adopted. But from the day India won independence from a colonizing power, it became a colonizing power itself. From that day, it went to war against Nagaland, against Manipur, against Mizoram. And since then, if you look at what the Indian state has been doing, you often hear people flinging this accusation against the Maoists that they believe in something called protracted war. Actually, in some ways, if you look at the doctrine of the Maoist doctrine, in many ways it's very similar. The idea of protracted war is very similar to the idea of jihad. It's a fight for a kind of justice, But the Indian state has waged a protracted war against people and subsumed nationalism from the time it came into being in 1947. And it has militarily intervened. Just look at the list. Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, Telangana, Goa, Hyderabad, Kashmir, of course, I'm not saying Punjab, against the Naxalites, and now in 69, and now they're thinking about calling out the army in central India against the poorest people in the world. And Najib just said in his presentation that the battle that Kashmiris face against the Indian military occupation, as opposed to Palestine, is a battle of inclusion, of them saying, you are our people. That's true and not true, because if you listen to the conversations about whether the army should be deployed in Chhattisgarh, they are always saying, how can the army be deployed against our own people? And I asked them, so many times at the airport to meet army people, and they said this to me. I said, so are you admitting that in Kashmir you are deployed against people that are not your own? So you're automatically admitting to the cause of the Kashmiri people. But there's been an intervention, and if you look at this list that I just named of what kind of people and places the Indian state has called out the army and has militarily intervened in Manipur, in Nagaland, in Mizoram, these are all Adivasi and Christian people. In Telangana, they were mostly Dalit and lower caste people. In Punjab, of course, it was the Sikhs. In Hyderabad, it was Muslims, and Goa, the Christians. The list shows you an upper caste Hindu state that is constantly at war against the other. So now when you talk about identity, and struggles for identity, or these, someone just asked a question saying that, is it not correct that the debates about what kind of Kashmir you want to have should happen after Azadi? That's never the case. No? If you look at the Indian War of Independence, look at the great debates between Gandhi and Ambedkar and Nehru and Jinnah, and these debates have to happen. They cannot be postponed to a later date because those debates are a part of the struggle. They are very much a part of the sharp blade of resistance. They are how you sharpen the resistance. So, of course, every colonizing power, like when these debates were happening in India, of course, whatever India is, it's the boundaries of what we knew as India were marked out by the British in 1899. So at that meeting day before yesterday, one of the people who spoke said that India is a prison house of many nationalities. What is India? But when the war for independence was happening, of course the British tried to use these divisions to try and postpone or to break, divide and rule, it's an old colonial game, so to pit the Hindus against the Muslims, the Dalits against the upper caste, this region against that region. Of course, the colonial power will always use whatever cracks it can see. But, eventually that doesn't mean that you don't have those debates. Because if you don't have those debates and you try and paper over them, they still know where the fault lines are, and they still try to use that against you. So the Indian government is saying to the Kashmiris, just like the British government said to the Indians, the natives are not ready for freedom, And eventually, look what happened with all those, with all the legacy of this so-called non-violent struggle, which was not a non-violent struggle. The Indian struggle for independence was not a non-violent struggle. It was. There were many armed struggles there, and then part of it was non-violent. But eventually, it left us with the legacy of partition, which was perhaps one of the greatest, most violent upheavals in history, in modern history. But those debates that we are talking about, which you are all very well aware of, have been used by the Indian state to divide you, to break you up, to make you fight each other. And as a result of that, from the fear of that, there's been a backing off of that intellectual engagement. So that eventually people are not exactly sure about what is the shape and what is the form of Arundhati. And there's nothing to be, there's absolutely nothing that should prevent people from debating it openly, as long as that doesn't result in killing each other, or weakening the struggle in any way. It's only going to make you stronger. Those debates are only going to make you stronger, as long as they're not you're not allowing somebody to use it against you.
Can I interrupt for a moment? Is it okay for people from Times Now to be videoing this thing on cameras?
Just from Times Now. Is there somebody from Times Now?
Yeah. Is there someone there?
Are you from Times Now?
No. With the little camera, is that okay?
Please. आप ऐसे नहीं करें ना. हमने जब बोला आपको नहीं करने के लिए.
सारे बंद कर दो ना. आप सारे कैमरे छोटे बंद कर दो.
So it's not about Times Now. When we have said that no one can record.
Little camera. I'm just asking. Is that okay to do it?
No. If it's Times Now, then it's.
Or anybody.
Then it's Mamnua.
I'm not going to speak for very long, because I think we can turn this into a conversation where people can actually, we can take this debate into whichever direction would most help to sharpen the conversations and deepen the understanding of the struggle here. I just wanted to say that once again, this conversation about what kind of mask the occupation itself wishes to fit upon the resistance, so that it can demonize it, so that it can come out looking like the good guy. This conversation about what kind of mask the occupation itself wishes to fit upon the resistance, so that it can demonize it, so that it can come out looking like the good guy. Why did why has this whole struggle been constantly put in front of the world and in front of the media as a sort of struggle of fundamentalist Islamists? See, the point is, if it is a struggle of fundamentalist Islamists, then that's fine. Put it forward. Let the people say this is what we want. Who is anybody to disagree? You have the right to be whatever you want to be. But in the late happening in the international and in our regional areas that sort of made this picture that everyone was supposed to then fit into. In the late 80s, when capitalism won its jihad against Soviet communism in the mountains of Afghanistan, two things happened in India. India, the government of India, which called itself non-aligned, which held itself with some pride in the international arena, suddenly became completely aligned and began to say that we are the natural allies of Israel and the US. And the Indian government opened two locks. One was the lock of the Babri Masjid, and the other was the lock of the Indian markets. And exactly at that same time, when it opened the locks of the Babri Masjid, was the time when America flipped from calling the people who were waging their jihad against the Soviet occupation in Afghanistan, suddenly from founding fathers, they became the world's greatest terrorists. At that same time, in India, began the movement for Hindutva, the whole Babri Masjid episode, and the corporatization. Both projects went side by side, hand in hand. And the end of a long manufacturing process of the opening of these two locks ended with the production or the manufacture of two kinds of terrorism. Terrorists, Islamist terrorists and the Maoist terrorists. And both, how does the Indian democracy function today? It has the BJP and the Congress, and it has ensured that whichever government comes to power, it will be right-wing and it will be militaristic, because it will always be dealing with some kind of terrorism. So today we have a country that calls itself the world's largest democracy, headed by a prime minister that has never won an election in his life. And with economic policies, that means India cannot have an 8% growth rate without becoming a militaristic power. By militaristic, I don't mean internationally a superpower, but by militarizing itself. Because the finance minister and the former finance minister, current home minister, Mr. Chidambaram, who was the representative as a legal advisor of all the various major corporations and mining companies that are plundering the land today, he says that it's his vision that 80% of Indian people should live in cities. This means that 500 million people will be uprooted from their villages. How can that happen unless this is not supervised by the army or the police? It cannot happen. And so what we are seeing, what we are going to see in India today is what you people have experienced over the last 20 years in Kashmir. A lot of us, I have traveled, Gautam has traveled in Chhattisgarh. You speak to the police or the BSF or the CRPF there. Many of them have been deployed in Kashmir, and now they are deployed in Chhattisgarh. And what you have is a situation where India is a colonial power. India is a colonial power that has fought in Nagaland and Manipur and all these states that I've told you about. What does it do? It sends the Nagas to Kashmir. It sends the Kashmiris to Chhattisgarh. It sends the Chhattisgarhis to Kashmir, the Tamilians to somewhere else, exactly like the British fought the First World War, the Second World War. And all of us are subjects of this colonial power, willingly recruiting ourselves to be deployed to oppress someone else. You go to Chhattisgarh, the most dreaded people there were the Naga battalion. You know, and yet about 10 days ago, the commander of the NSTL, the Naga movement, had come to see me. And he was telling me about the history of the struggle, which began in 1966, and the ceasefire was signed in 1997. So I said, tell me, do you have a body count? Because we know the body count in Kashmir, 70,000 people killed in 20 years. Do you have a body count? He said, well, the Naga government has a body count, but I think it's a little exaggerated. So I said, well, what is it? He said to me, 250,000 people. I mean, I don't know what he meant by a little exaggerated, but even if it's doubled, you know. And yet, the world doesn't know about this, because India's got this great publicity going. We are a democracy. So, you know, the situation in India, recently I traveled in North Telangana with a woman called Padma. Padma was with the PW, the People's War Group. She was arrested just about a week after she had had her appendix removed. She was caught. She was beaten in the police station till she hemorrhaged and had to have almost all her organs removed. Then they broke her knee and told her, this is so that you'll never walk in the forest again. She was in prison for 8 years. The only time she was allowed out was when her husband, who was also in the CPI Maoist, was killed. So she was allowed to attend his funeral. And today she runs an organization called the Committee for the Retrieval of Dead Bodies from Illegal Encounters in India. She goes around North Telangana, mostly in a tractor, getting the bodies of people who have been killed by the police to their homes. I traveled with her to these homes. And you know, the biggest room that I went into, the biggest home that I went into was much less than the size of this platform. And she told me, Padma told me that, you know, Arundhati, these are middle class homes. You know, the poorer people, they don't have houses. They live outside, you know, under, in the open or under a thatch. Now, this is what is going on in this country. You know, I went to Kadalur, which is in Tamil Nadu, with a friend of mine who is a Dalit MLA. I said to him, I said, take me to a place where a Dalit soldier who was killed in Kashmir has been buried. There was an SP with us. He took me to a garbage heap. Where there's a separate pump for water for Dalit soldiers to be cremated. You know? And the upper caste people will not allow the body of that Dalit soldier to be carried past their houses because it will pollute them. And I turned around and I asked the SP, I said, tell me, what is your job here? Is your job to make sure that those bodies are carried down the street with dignity and buried with dignity? And he said, ma'am, my job is to preserve law and order, which means to make sure that that does not happen. So, you know, when we are talking about identities and battles and struggles, sometimes my mind is a whirl, you know. I don't know how to how to think about these things anymore. So I just revert. Earlier this year, Gautam did that journey too, and so did I. Traveled for weeks. I spent 2.5 weeks with the Maoists in the forest. You know, they have been working there for 30 years, doing politics, you know, which means not just guerrilla warfare, but working. What was that first initial battle with people who have nothing but loincloths, fighting for तेंदू पत्ता का दाम कि 5 पैसा ज़्यादा चाहिए हमें इसके लिए. And that was a monumental fight, you know. And today, that political work of theirs has become something which the Indian government, for reasons of its own, of course, calls the greatest internal security threat. But in that forest, I walked with the comrades. I walked with the People's Liberation Guerrilla Army, 50% of whom are women. You know, and you've got to hand it to those women. I went in there thinking, like many liberal feminists, that, oh, an armed struggle is disempowering for women. You know, that the women inside are going to be in terrible conditions. I was disabused of that, because many of the women who joined that struggle joined it in order to get away from the patriarchy of their own traditions and their own communities, you know. And what women they were. You know, I for the first time, I tell you, for the first time in my life in India, I lay in that forest and I felt that there was enough space for all my organs in my body. You know, I saluted them. I said, wow, you know, this gives us a reason to stand up and say, Zindabad. And I believe that here too, in Kashmir, women have played a very, very important part. You know, it doesn't have to be like everybody doesn't have to go and pick up a gun or become a guerrilla fighter. You know, I keep saying in India that I believe in a biodiversity of resistance. And I believe in a biodiversity of resistance. And I want to say that here, that resistance is a beautiful thing, but it has many meanings and many facets. You know, what constitutes resistance is not just one thing. Just like you cannot call a group of trees, which is just one kind of tree, a forest. A forest has biodiversity, and that's what makes it strong. It cannot just get wiped out by one kind of pest. In that way, in India, there is a biodiversity of resistance that's standing up to the state, you know. And that biodiversity of resistance requires that you tap in to everybody. It's not just to say, the stone pelters are doing what they're doing so I can stay at home. But a real resistance would be, what can I do? You know, I'm a doctor, or I'm a lawyer, or I'm a teacher, or I'm a housewife. But what can I do that will lend solidarity to this struggle? Because at the end of the day, you know, all colonial occupations are facilitated by the creation of a native elite. You know, it's not that the Indian army is occupying Kashmir. There is an elite that is allowing that occupation, you know. And in India too, it isn't that when the British colonized India that there was thousands of British troops that were holding India down. It was a co-optation of the elite, you know. So when we talk about how do you resist an occupation, there are, I think there are two tiers, you know. One is a set of goals or a set of demands that you might place on the occupying power. That we want you to withdraw the AFPSA, we want you to demilitarize, we want you to release prisoners, you know, a set of demands. But that occupying power is eventually what it is. It's an occupying power. Power concedes nothing unless it's forced to. So by merely asking, it's not going to happen. So then how do you actually take this resistance forward? Because I think that's what the next session is going to be. How do you take this forward? Because either you see the last 20 years of resistance as a linear progression in which you have fought, you have paid a price, you have won something, you have lost something, you move forward and consolidated, and then, you know, the occupation has put an end to that, then something else happens and you move forward a little more. Or you look at it as if, are you short-circuiting yourselves, you know? Have you created a circuit in which something happens and it just keeps getting short-circuited, and you cannot consolidate the gains you've made? That I'm not saying this or that has happened, but it's a question that the resistance has to ask itself. Is it progressing, or is it a series of short circuits where you gain something and then you lose that ground again, and then you gain something and then you lose that ground again? Is that what's happening, or is there a steady progression, however slow, forward? Is there a clear idea of what's going to happen next? That doesn't mean you can control it. You have to face losses, but are you moving ahead? Because sometimes when you hear talk about the fact that Kashmiris have been ruled or repressed or occupied for centuries, then you must worry that occupation is not a part of your cellular structure. You know, it doesn't have to be a part of your cellular structure. And is there anything that you can do? Are there any goals that you can set, not the Indian state, but yourself? You know, for example, is there any possibility of saying that the goal of the resistance is that we don't want our people to join the police. We don't want our people to join the CRPF. We don't want... The first time I ever went to Chhattisgarh, after many years of traveling through Kashmir, it really broke my heart. You know, the journey from Raipur to Datewara stopped at this dhaba, and it was full of Kashmiri BSF who were going to oppress the Chhattisgarh. You know? Can we stop this colonial power from using us in these ways? You know, the Naga mothers actually called back the Naga battalion at one point from Chhattisgarh. But can we see the design in this? And can we set ourselves some real goals that we're not going to let this happen? You know? I think to understand that meeting place between the occupation and those who are facilitating it, not necessarily, I don't mean this in an ugly way, but I mean, can people see what they are doing is actually undoing the work of the stone pelters or undoing the work of the militants? Because you gained a tremendous amount of ground in these last 4 months. Are you going to concede that, or are you going to build on that? You know? So how to do that? How to understand what this occupation is, what it does to your mind? What, you know? Because otherwise what happens is that however terrible the price that is paid. However many people have been killed, the real risk is that it turns into a temper tantrum by children against their parents. And then the parent says, okay, come down, we'll give you something. So you don't want to have a temper tantrum. You want to be part of the resistance. You don't want people to say, I agree with Gautam when he talked about elections. However, it's important to understand how the people who voted in that election, how that election was used against you in the world. It was used against you, And I remember that I was in Kashmir when the Amarnath Yatra uprising happened, and I wrote that piece. And after that, when the elections happened, I was at the Srinagar airport, and someone came to me and said, Arundhati, you must never trust us Kashmiris, because we will let you down. I said, it's nothing to do with me. It's a battle that you're fighting. But that's also part of the psychological operation, that you mustn't trust yourself. But you must understand what is the message that's going out, You can't allow somebody else to paint your portrait for you. Let you paint that portrait. And to do that, there has to be a deepening of the understanding of politics. There's like I often say that I've written extensively about the Narmada Valley, where, there was a huge movement against big dams. And sometimes I wish that the intelligence of the Kashmir Valley could be fused into the intelligence of the Narmada Valley. So there are two different kinds of intelligence. In the Narmada Valley, they talk about repression, but they don't even know the beginning of what repression can be. But they have a very, very sophisticated understanding of the economic structures, of the ecological price, of the cultural price that this new world order is paying. In Kashmir, you have such a sophisticated understanding of repression, but a very rudimentary understanding of the big picture, of how economics, how the corporate world is working. When you say we want to control our own resources, what does that mean? That we want to build our own dams and make our own mines and displace our own people? Or is there a new understanding? There are these repositories of understanding in the world that need to merge and fuse with each other. So I think there's so much to be gained by this, by understanding what is. I read about the reports of what happened in Delhi a few days ago when the meeting happened, and Jinani Sahib was there. I was also there. I was kind of curious why nobody seemed to even wonder, how did that meeting happen? Who organized it? It was a historic thing. There were people from all over India who came and spoke out in solidarity, who are today being accused of sedition, who might run the risk of being imprisoned. But why is nobody curious? Who are those people? Why did they risk it? It's not like Gilani Sahib just parachuted in there and the meeting was organized by the Hurriyat. Somebody organized it. Somebody sent out those invitations. Somebody expressed solidarity. But, who are they? And why did they do it? These are questions which I think are not, I'm not saying this because you need to just express solidarity with suffering people elsewhere. I'm not saying that. It doesn't matter. I think it will deepen this resistance to understand that politics in very, very serious ways. And it will make you stronger, and it will make them stronger too. So, I think we can just have conversation and question. after this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the speech.